every step of the way, there are things you can do to bring that anxiety back under control. Okay, so the first thing that happens when we have an anxiety response is our bodies react. There's actually just a physical reaction that we have, and it's pretty universal and it's very familiar to all of us. Your heart rate accelerates, your breathing gets really quick and shallow. It feels uncomfortable. There's other stuff happening in our bodies too at the same time, but that activated heart, that kind of hyperventilating sense of breathing, everybody knows that feeling. Okay, what's happening here? The sympathetic nervous system, which is the part of our nervous system that is paying attention to the environment, is sympathetic to what's around us, is kicking off some degree of the fight or flight response, right? That ancient response that we all know about. And in the fight or flight response, what we want to do is get ready to run or attack. And so our sympathetic nervous system is taking measures to send a whole lot of heavily oxygenated blood out to our large muscle groups for that purpose. That's why the heart accelerates. That's why breathing changes. And I, especially, in caring for people who have not ever heard any of this before, it can be really helpful to understand that as strange as this reaction is, it has a sort of ancient logic to it, may not fit the moment, but it definitely makes sense. And it's not something going, kind of out of whack when our heart and our lungs accelerate. So that's the first thing that happens. The second thing that happens is we notice that change in our body and we come to the conclusion that we're going to call it anxiety. We decide to use that label. This is often an arbitrary decision. We can call it something else, but we can sometimes default unhelpfully to calling it anxiety. And then the third thing that happens, and this is where things really do go off the rails, is we engage in catastrophic thinking. And the definition of catastrophic thinking is actually very straightforward. It's when we overestimate the risks and we underestimate our ability to manage the risks. That's it. Okay, so if your body reacts, you're like, I must be anxious. Oh my gosh, this situation is completely out of control and there's nothing I can do to stop it. That's when anxiety really becomes miserable. And that's the 1, 2, 3. All right, so knowing that, let's go back and hit every one of these in terms of how we can work against them. So the first one, the body reacting. Okay, so one of the most powerful ways to get the body to calm down is through controlled breathing. And I will tell you, if you're having like this, really breathing, like you're going to go to breathing, I totally get it. For years, I was like, oh, that's so woo-woo. That's not that technical. It's not that scientific. Okay, I was wrong. I learned I was wrong. And in fact, breathing is this really biological intervention. And what it does is it kickstarts the parasympathetic part of our nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system, its job is to reset the body to its resting state. Okay, here's how this works. It's kind of amazing. So just as the brain can signal to the heart and lungs, like go into overdrive, we might have to do something here. We're also of a mind that the lungs can communicate back to the brain. So when we're anxious, we're breathing quickly and, kind of shallowly. And if we override that, if we deliberately deepen and slow our breathing, what we think we're doing, this is sort of the understood science, is that we are hacking into a set of nerves on the surface of our lungs that are stretch receptors. And all day, every day, those nerves are paying attention to our breathing to keep us safe. And they notice that we have slowed our breathing and things have gotten calmer. And they read that as evidence of safety because we only breathe deeply and slowly when we're safe. And they send that message up to the brain saying, you're kind of having a reaction that doesn't make sense because the nerves on the lungs are telling us that we must be safe. And that's how anxiety comes under control. That's step 1. Step 2, if we want to, need to, is to consider whether anxiety is the right name for what's happening. That we have a kind of activated response all the time. So it might be like, I was excited for this presentation. And before this presentation, I kind of felt a little bit of a rev. I could have said, I must be anxious. But instead I said, no, I think I'm really excited. And that shift in thinking actually makes a huge difference in terms of how we feel about what we're engaging. The third thing we want to watch out for is anxiety going off the rails with catastrophic thinking. And again, that's overestimating risk, underestimating our ability to handle it. So if something is feeling really, really scary to you, really, really anxiety provoking, key questions to ask yourself are, am I imagining this to be worse than it might really be? So you're going to try to bring that estimation of risk down. And also, do I have more say in how this is going to go than I'm giving myself credit for? Are there things I can do to actually increase my sense of control, not feel as helpless as I do right now? So you're not trying to get rid of the anxiety entirely, but you're trying to sort of get it in a narrower band of not overestimating risk and not underestimating your own powers. Okay, so I'm going to start to wrap up, but here is the bottom line. Most of the time, we don't need to feel anxious about feeling anxious. It really is there to help us out. And whether we want it there or not, or whether it's helping us or not, if we want to get it under control, knowing the basics of how it unfolds really does put you in the driver's seat of knowing how to calm yourself when you feel anxious. And so you don't have to feel like it's something that you are at the mercy of.
Or are there any differences between words like anxiety and worry or fear as it might pertain to how a teenager is describing or trying to put a name to what they're feeling?
I think it means to the kid whatever it means. But I will say teenagers use the term anxiety a lot, and they use it very broadly. And I've been practicing for a very long time. And then in the last, I'd say 10 years, I started to notice like kids use this term a lot. And I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. And then I was actually rereading Jane Eyre. No, it was Pride and Prejudice. And Mrs. Bennet, I don't know if you remember her. She's like the kind of piece of work mom in that book. There was a line in the book that was, whenever Mrs. Bennet was discontented, she fancied herself to be nervous. And I thought, oh, I think that's often what I'm seeing with teenagers is they'll say, I feel anxious when they usually mean not calm. I don't feel calm. And so the first thing I would do if a teenager says, I feel anxious, is to say, tell me what's going on. And they might say, I've got a big tryout tomorrow, or, I'm really, this concert is happening that I'm going to with my friends. And listen for the possibility that it's something besides anxiety. It could be they're excited, they're amped, they're apprehensive. So try to make more granular their description of what is causing the stirred up feeling. And sometimes they are anxious. And that's when there's a threat, right? They're like, I'm feeling anxious because I have my driver's test tomorrow and I am not ready. That is anxiety. There is a threat. They could fail that driver's test, right? So listen for threat. And then if they do have anxiety, if they're anxious about something, be like, yeah, well, of course you're anxious. Like, that's kind of scary. Like, let's see what we can do to reduce your sense of risk, increase your sense of control. But often it's very important that we help them bring more nuance to the language they use around a sort of sense of being stirred up. And what's so nice is that act of a teenager saying or a kid saying, I feel really anxious about, school tomorrow. And you're like, what's making you anxious? They're like, new classroom, new kids, like, don't know where things are going to be like. And you say, yeah, like, you should feel apprehensive. Like that is like, there's a lot there. And also maybe a little excited. If you can get in there with words that are more accurate than the big generic of anxiety, that act is in and of itself therapeutic. Kids are like, yes, I am apprehensive and also excited, right? That they feel heard, they feel better, and they have a better language. So what I watch for especially is kids saying, I have anxiety. I like to say, you're feeling anxious. Because I think, there is this sense of like, I have anxiety. I think there's very much among adolescents a sense of like, I have anxiety. And what I try not to say is, well, everybody has anxiety at some level, because I don't want to be dismissive, but to really help them make that distinction between a feeling that comes and goes and a diagnosis that they would need to be concerned about.
Several folks want to know, how can they tell when to seek help, when anxiety has become too crippling?
This is a great place to wrap up, right? This is a perfect place to wrap up. So mostly this has been an ad for anxiety. Like, don't be frightened of it. Be curious about it. Trust that it's trying to tell you something. If it feels too uncomfortable, try these strategies to get it under control. But two conditions, let's go back to them. If you feel like your anxiety is showing up and there's no reason, like there's no threat, there's nothing to be worried about, that would be a great time to seek out support. The other is, if your anxiety, you're like, well, there is a threat, but like my anxiety is off the charts and making me miserable or getting in the way of my life, that's a good time to seek support. So, pretty straightforward in terms of how we define what we consider concerning. But I really want you to know most anxiety does not need to make you feel anxious about